Sophia Carter faces unfair treatment at Oceanic First Bank. It was a busy afternoon at Oceanic First Bank, and Sophia Carter, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher, stood patiently in line, clutching an envelope with her bank statements. The bank was filled with customers shifting impatiently, sighing as they checked their watches, the frustration in the air palpable. Employees hurried back and forth, struggling to keep up with the growing lines. Sophia wasn't here for anything complicated, she just needed answers. Over the past 2 months, she had noticed unexpected fees deducted from her account. They weren't large amounts, but on a fixed pension, every dollar mattered. She had always been independent, never one to ask for handouts or special treatment. But today, she needed someone to listen, a dismissive welcome. When it was finally her turn, she stepped forward to the counter, greeted by Brianna Wallace, a young teller with tired eyes and an impatient demeanor. "Good afternoon," Sophia said politely, offering a small smile. "I believe there's been a mistake on my account. I've been charged fees I wasn't informed about." Brianna barely looked up from her keyboard, fingers tapping as she sighed. "Those are standard account maintenance fees, ma'am," she replied. Flatly, still focused on her screen, Sophia hesitated. "But I've had this account for years, and I've never seen these charges before." Brianna sighed dramatically this time, finally glancing at Sophia with clear annoyance. She snatched the envelope from Sophia's hands, flipped through the papers half-heartedly, and then shoved them back toward her. "It's in the fine print of your agreement," Brianna said. "If you didn't read it, that's not our fault." A few people in line chuckled quietly, and Sophia felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. Her grip tightened on the envelope. She wasn't trying to argue, she just wanted fairness. The manager's indifference before Sophia could respond. A tall man in a suit approached the counter. It was Eric Johansson, the branch manager, his arms crossed as if deciding whether this situation deserved his time. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. Brianna straightened her posture immediately. "No, sir," she said quickly, like a student reporting to a strict teacher. "Just a customer who doesn't understand our policies." Sophia turned to Eric, hopeful that he would actually listen. "I've had this account for over 30 years, she said, her voice steady. "These fees just started appearing. All I'm asking for is a review." Eric let out a short, amused chuckle, shaking his head. "What's in the system is in the system, ma'am," he said. "We don't review automated charges." Sophia's stomach dropped. The words felt final, like she was talking to a wall. Then came the final insult. Eric leaned slightly over the counter, his voice just loud enough for the entire bank to hear. "If you can't afford the fees, maybe this isn't the right bank for you." Public humiliation, a sharp silence filled the room. Customers who had been impatient just moments ago stopped fidgeting. Some looked down, pretending not to have heard. Others glanced at Sophia with quiet sympathy but said nothing. Sophia swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She had never felt so small. Her entire life, she had been a teacher, a mentor, someone who encouraged others to stand up for what was right. And yet, here she was, being treated like she was nothing. She could feel her hands trembling slightly as she held onto her papers. All she wanted was respect. Just as she was about to turn away in defeat, a voice cut through the air. A voice of defiance. "Why are you talking to her like that?" The entire bank fell silent. Heads turned toward the entrance. A man in a black t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap stood there. He looked like any other customer at first glance, but there was something about him, his posture, his voice, his presence that made people straighten up. Eric turned slowly, irritation flashing across his face. "And who are you to question how we handle our customers?" The man stepped forward, pulling off his cap, revealing a face that everyone recognized immediately. Dante Storm, the Hollywood star, the action legend, the man who had played some of the toughest, most fearless characters on screen. And now he was standing in the middle of Oceanic First Bank, staring Erik Johansson down. The confident stance Erik had just moments ago faltered. Dante's gaze was steady, unreadable, but his voice was calm and controlled. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said. "What matters is why you're treating this woman like this." Everything changes for the first time since Sophia had stepped into the bank. The power dynamic shifted. She turned to Dante, eyes wide with disbelief. Erik cleared his throat, scrambling to regain control of the situation. "Sir, this is none of your business. We have policies in place, and this lady doesn't meet the requirements." Dante tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, knowing smile, he asked, "Policies? Or an excuse to humiliate someone who's just asking for fairness?" A few customers murmured in agreement. Brianna, who had seemed so confident earlier, now glanced nervously at Erik, waiting for him to fix this mess. Dante turned back to Sophia, his voice gentler now. "Monsieur A.M., what exactly is the problem? Can you show me what's going on?" Sophia hesitated for a moment before handing him the envelope. Dante took it carefully, scanning the documents inside. After a few seconds, he looked up at Erik, his expression unchanged. "This is a mistake," Dante said plainly. "These charges shouldn't be here. You're going to fix this." Erik opened his mouth, but Dante raised a hand again, stopping him. "If it's a mistake, you'll fix it," Dante continued, his voice steady. "And if it's not," his voice dropped slightly, becoming even more controlled, "then it's going to be a much bigger problem for you." The tension in the bank was thick enough to cut with a knife. And for the first time that day, Erik Johansson looked truly nervous. Dante stormed challenges the bank's practices. The air in Oceanic First Bank was thick with tension. What had started as another day of routine dismissals and corporate indifference had suddenly transformed into a scene that no one could ignore. Dante Storm stood at the center of it all, his presence alone shifting the power dynamic. The once unshaken Erik Johansson, the branch manager who had so confidently humiliated Sophia Carter, was now visibly unsettled. His polished confidence faltered, and for the first time since their encounter began, he hesitated. Sophia, still clutching her envelope of documents, watched in quiet disbelief. She had walked into the bank alone, feeling powerless against a system that had already decided she didn't matter. And yet, here was someone powerful, respected, and impossible to ignore demanding answers on her behalf. And the entire bank was watching. Confronting injustice, Dante held Sophia's documents in his hands, scanning them with calm precision. The hush that had settled over the bank only amplified the sound of shuffling papers and nervous shifting from employees behind the counter. After a moment, he looked up. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was clear, controlled, and unwavering. "This is a mistake," he said simply. "These charges shouldn't be here." Erik let out a strained chuckle, attempting to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Storm, I don't think you understand how banking works. Fees are determined at a corporate level. We don't just erase them." Dante tilted his head slightly, his sharp gaze narrowing. "Right," he said slowly, as if processing the words. "So you're telling me that without ever checking, without even reviewing the account, you already know these charges are justified?" Erik's throat tightened. "We follow policies," he said quickly. "Customers who don't meet certain requirements are subject to fees. That's just how the system works." Dante took a step closer to the counter. His voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it, a quiet authority that made everyone lean in just a little closer. "So you don't check?" Dante asked. Erik hesitated. "The system is designed to be accurate," he said, but his words lacked the certainty they once held. Dante let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "That's not what I asked." A few customers in line shifted uncomfortably, now murmuring among themselves. A woman near the back clutched her purse a little tighter, while a middle-aged man in a work uniform crossed his arms, nodding in quiet agreement. A bank full of unanswered questions. Dante turned back to Sophia. "You've had this account for how long?" he asked. 30 years, she said quietly, still shocked by everything unfolding. "And in that time," Dante continued, "how many times have you been charged these maintenance fees?" Sophia swallowed hard. "Never," she said, "until 2 months ago." Dante nodded, turning back to Eric. "You see where I'm going with this?" Eric's face was ashen. His confident smirk was long gone. And before he could craft another excuse, Dante turned to the bank's customers. "How many of you," Dante called out, "have been banking here for years?" Slowly, hands began to rise. The elderly couple near the front, the woman holding a baby, the man in the work uniform. More hands followed, one by one. Dante's smile was subtle but pointed. "And how many of you," he continued, "noticed new fees suddenly appearing in the last 2 months?" More hands went up. Now, Eric was trapped. The moment the truth became unavoidable, Brianna Wallace, the bank teller who had once mocked Sophia with smug indifference, glanced nervously at Eric. She could see what was happening. Everyone could. Dante tapped Sophia's papers against the counter, straightening them as he spoke. "So it's not just her," he said. "It's dozens of people, maybe more." A young man near the front, phone raised, was already recording the entire scene. Eric's gaze flickered toward the camera, and for the first time that afternoon, he looked genuinely afraid. Forced to fix what should never have happened, Dante let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to fully absorb what was happening. Then he leaned slightly against the counter, his expression relaxed but firm. "So here's what's going to happen," he said. The bank was dead silent. "You're going to reverse these fees," Dante said, his voice steady. "Not just for Sophia, but for every single customer who was unfairly charged." Eric swallowed. "Mr. Storm, Dante raised a hand, cutting him off. "And then," he added, "you're going to apologize, properly." The tension in the room was thick. Brianna, sensing there was no way out, turned to the computer. With shaky hands, she began typing. Sophia watched in astonishment as she saw the numbers change on the screen. Her account balance was restored, the unjust fees wiped away as if they had never existed. The same was happening for others, in line one by one. Customers began checking their accounts, watching as the damage was undone. Dante turned back to Eric. "Now, let's hear it." Eric's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but there was no escaping this. He exhaled sharply. "Miss S. Carter," he said stiffly, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Dante raised an eyebrow. Eric sighed through his teeth. "I apologize," he repeated, "for the way you were treated. It was unacceptable." Sophia stared at him for a long moment, then finally nodded. Dante glanced around the bank, making sure everyone had seen what just happened. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" he said with a slight smirk. The power of speaking up Sophia left the bank feeling different than when she walked in. She had come alone, feeling powerless against a system designed to keep people like her quiet. But now, she felt seen, heard, respected. And she knew that because one person had refused to let her be silenced, she would never doubt her own voice again. As she stepped outside, she turned to Dante, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "Thank you," she said. Dante smiled. "You didn't need me to fight for you," he said. "You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you." And with that, he put his cap back on, turned around, and walked away. The bank is forced to act. A moment of reckoning. The air inside Oceanic First Bank had shifted. What had started as a routine dismissal of an elderly customer's concerns had now turned into a moment of public accountability. Dante's storm had not only called out the injustice, but he had also forced Eric Johansson into a corner, a place where excuses and arrogance could no longer shield him. As the weight of the moment settled over the room, every customer, every employee, and every set of eyes in the bank were watching. Sophia Carter, standing at the counter, still gripped her envelope, but something had changed. She no longer felt small or powerless. She wasn't alone in this anymore. And neither were the other customers who had started speaking up, a bank caught in its own lies. Dante stood firm, his presence commanding but calm. He had already exposed the pattern of unfair fees, and the crowd of customers had confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't just a mistake affecting one person. This was a widespread issue, one that Oceanic First had hoped no one would notice. Dante tapped the papers against the counter, straightening them as he spoke. "So, Eric," he said smoothly, "looks like we have a bit of a problem here." The branch manager's face was pale, beads of sweat forming at his temple. His previous arrogance was gone, replaced by something far less confident. Eric started, but Dante raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I don't need another excuse," Dante said, his voice calm but firm. "I need solutions, and I need them now." Eric's jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. For years, he had dismissed customers like Sophia without a second thought. But today, the entire world was watching. And worst of all, there were cameras recording. A young man near the front of the line held up his phone, capturing every second of Eric's squirming discomfort. The realization that this video would be all over the internet made the bank manager visibly tense. Fixing what should never have happened, Dante turned to Brianna Wallace, the teller who had initially dismissed Sophia with sarcasm and indifference. "You," he said, nodding toward her. Brianna's face drained of color as she realized she had nowhere to hide. "Pull up Sophia Carter's account," Dante instructed. "We're going to see these fees for ourselves." Brianna glanced at Eric nervously, waiting for him to override the command, but Eric remained silent. He knew there was no way out of this. With shaky hands, Brianna began typing. The screen flickered to life, revealing the truth in bright, glaring numbers. Dante leaned forward slightly, scanning the information. A slow, knowing smile crossed his face. "Well, look at that," he said, tapping the screen. "The fees started exactly 2 months ago, right after a bank policy change." The room was dead silent as more customers in line pulled out their phones, checking their own accounts. One by one, their expressions changed. A public uprising, a middle-aged man in a work uniform frowned. "Wait a minute, this happened to me too." An elderly couple near the back exchanged a glance before the woman pulled out her checkbook. "We got hit with those charges too, and we've been banking here for decades." A younger woman holding a baby shook her head in disbelief. "I thought it was just me. I got charged last month for something I never agreed to." Dante turned back to Eric, his smile fading. "You still want to tell me this is just policy?" Eric swallowed hard, shifting his weight. His gaze darted around the room, looking for a way out, but there was none. The final blow. "You have 2 choices," Dante said, his voice even but final. "One, you reverse these charges for every single person here who was unfairly charged." He let the words sink in before continuing. "Or 2, this video gets uploaded, and by tomorrow, Oceanic First is all over the news for targeting elderly customers with fraudulent fees." Eric's breath hitched. This wasn't just about Sophia anymore. This was about the bank's entire reputation. The video was already spreading online. Customers were angry, vocal, and demanding answers. There was only one way out, and it was Dante's way. Eric gritted his teeth and turned to Brianna. "Fix it," he muttered. Brianna didn't hesitate this time. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, reversing Sophia's fees. Then, one by one, every other affected customer saw their charges disappear. Dante watched as the numbers on the screen changed, his arms folded across his chest. "Now," he said, turning back to Eric, "let's hear it." Eric closed his eyes for a brief second, then exhaled sharply. He turned to Sophia, forcing the words out. "Mrs. Carter," he said stiffly, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Dante raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Eric's jaw clenched. "I apologize for the way you were treated. It was unacceptable." Sophia held his gaze for a long moment before giving a slow nod. Dante, satisfied, glanced around the room. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" he said with a slight smirk. The bank buzzed with quiet conversations, some customers still in shock at what had just happened. Dante turned to Sophia, his expression gentler now. "You good?" She took a deep breath, then nodded. For the first time that day, she felt heard. Dante patted the counter. "Then my job here is done." And just like that, he put his cap back on, turned around, and walked out. Corporate fallout and justice served. The dust had barely settled at Oceanic First Bank, but the consequences were already unfolding. Sophia Carter, once dismissed and humiliated, had walked out with her dignity intact, while Eric Johansson, the once powerful branch manager, was left scrambling to contain the damage. But the story was far from over, because while Sophia had left the bank, the rest of the world was just beginning to hear about what had happened. The power of a viral moment. The young man who had recorded the entire encounter had wasted no time uploading it online, and within hours, it was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, news sites. The video titled "Hollywood Star Calls Out Bank Manager for Exploiting Elderly Customers" was gaining millions of views. People weren't just watching, they were furious. The comment sections exploded. "This is why people don't trust banks. They take advantage of those who can't fight back." Dante Storm just did more for this woman than that bank ever would have. "I hope this manager gets fired. This is unacceptable." And the biggest problem, Oceanic First's corporate office, was now in full crisis mode. The bank responds too late. By the next morning, Oceanic First released a statement. It was generic, one of those carefully crafted PR responses designed to minimize damage. Oceanic First Bank is committed to treating all customers with fairness and respect. We take these concerns seriously and are conducting an internal review of the incident. But the public wasn't buying it, because the damage had already been done. By the afternoon, major news networks picked up the story. Corporate executives were now under pressure to take real action. And that's when the decision came down. Eric Johansson is fired within 48 hours. Oceanic First announced Eric Johansson's immediate termination. The official statement cited failure to uphold company values and multiple customer complaints. But everyone knew the real reason he got caught. For years, Eric had treated elderly customers like Sophia as easy targets. He had dismissed their complaints, ignored their concerns, and counted on them not having the energy or resources to fight back. But this time, the world had watched it happen in real time, and there was no escaping it. Brianna Wallace's fate, meanwhile. Brianna Wallace, the bank teller who had initially mocked Sophia, was also under scrutiny. Unlike Eric, she wasn't fired, but she was placed under review after admitting that she had been pressured to follow unethical instructions. And while she kept her job, it came with a clear warning: if she ever treated a customer that way again, she wouldn't be so lucky. Justice for Sophia and other customers, but the real victory wasn't just Eric's downfall, it was what happened next. Oceanic First, now desperate to repair its reputation, announced that all unfair fees charged to elderly customers over the past 6 months would be refunded in full. For Sophia and countless others, justice had been served, and all because one person had the courage to speak up and another had the power to make sure the world listened. Sophia receives a special gift from Dante Storm Days, After the events at Oceanic First Bank, Sophia Carter found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She had walked into that bank expecting just another frustrating experience, one where she would be ignored, dismissed, and ultimately forced to accept an unfair system that had never been built to serve people like her. But that day had been different, not because she had demanded to be heard, but because someone else had stepped in to amplify her voice. And now the world had taken notice. A moment of quiet victory. The public fallout from the viral video had led to real change. Erik Johansson had been fired, the bank had been forced to refund unfair fees, and for the first time in a long time, Sophia felt like people were finally paying attention. But what mattered most to her wasn't just the apology or the policy changes. It was the fact that, for the first time in years, she had been seen, not as an old woman, not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. An unexpected delivery one morning as she sat by her window sipping tea, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she was greeted by a delivery man holding a thick envelope. She wasn't expecting anything. The return address read Los Angeles, California. Curious, she opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten note. It read, "Miss S. Carter, you didn't need me to stand up for you. You already had the strength. You just needed someone to remind you. Hope this makes you smile." Dante Storm tears welled in Sophia's eyes as she ran her fingers over the ink. This wasn't a corporate written apology letter. This wasn't some automated email from the bank. This was real. And tucked inside the envelope, along with the note, was a signed memorabilia from his latest project and an invitation to one of his movie premieres. A small gesture, a big impact. Sophia laughed softly, shaking her head. She wasn't one for Hollywood premieres. She hadn't been to a movie theater in years. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Dante had remembered her. He had taken the time to send her something personal, something meaningful. And that, more than anything, made her feel valued. She set the note down carefully, running her fingers over his signature. For so long, she had felt invisible, like the world had already decided that she wasn't worth listening to. But now, she knew better. She wasn't just another elderly customer being dismissed at a bank. She was Sophia Carter, a woman who had spent her life teaching, nurturing, and shaping young minds. A woman who had stood up for herself even when it felt like no one else would. And a woman who, thanks to one moment, one voice, and one unexpected ally, had been reminded of something important. She was never powerless to begin with. A lesson in strength and the power of speaking up. Sophia Carter had spent a lifetime teaching others, guiding students, shaping young minds, and ensuring that knowledge was never taken for granted. But as she sat at her kitchen table, holding the handwritten note from Dante Storm, she realized something. Even at 72 years old, life still had lessons left to teach her. The events at Oceanic First Bank had reminded her of a truth she had once taught her students. Silence allows injustice to continue, but speaking up can change everything. She had walked into that bank alone, expecting no help, expecting no fairness. For years she had accepted that people like her, the elderly, the ones who weren't important to corporations, were expected to just accept things as they were. But that day, everything had changed. The lasting impact of one voice. It wasn't just about her fees being refunded. It was about every other person in that bank who found the courage to check their accounts. It was about the employees, even Brianna Wallace, who now knew they couldn't dismiss people so easily. It was about Erik Johansson learning that power isn't permanent when you misuse it. And it was about Dante Storm stepping in, not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Most importantly, it was about her. Because for the first time in years, Sophia no longer felt invisible. A new perspective on life. As she set the note down, she thought about all the other moments in her life when she had let things go, when she had accepted mistreatment because she felt powerless to change it. She thought about the other elderly customers at Oceanic First Bank, the ones who had been taken advantage of, but had no one to fight for them. She thought about the way people had whispered and laughed when she had first tried to speak up. And she thought about how different the world could be if more people, young and old, found the courage to demand fairness. Sophia had spent a lifetime believing that her battles were behind her. But now, she realized she still had a voice. She still had the power to stand up for herself and for others. Moving forward with strength, Sophia smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. Dante had been right. She had never needed him to fight for her. She had the strength all along. She just needed a reminder, and now she would carry that strength with her for the rest of her days. Because the world wasn't just for the young, it was for anyone willing to stand tall and speak up. And Sophia Carter had just found her voice again. A renewed sense of strength and purpose. Sophia Carter had spent most of her life advocating for others. As a school teacher, she had instilled in her students the importance of standing up for what's right, of using their voices even when it felt like no one was listening. But in her later years, she had begun to lose faith in that lesson herself. The world had changed. People were busier, more impatient. It often felt like the elderly had become invisible, their voices drowned out by the rush of modern life. And before the incident at Oceanic First Bank, she had started to believe that maybe this was just how things were, now that she had to accept being dismissed, ignored, and brushed aside. But now she knew better. The power of speaking up that day at the bank had changed everything. Not just because her fees had been refunded, not just because Eric Johansson had been fired, but because Sophia had been reminded of something she had forgotten. She still mattered. Her voice still mattered, and when she used it, she could make real change happen. Dante Storm had stepped in that day, but she had been the one who started it all. She had been the one to demand answers. She had been the one who refused to accept being mistreated. And now, she carried that lesson with her, not just for herself, but for everyone else who had ever felt unheard. A call to others. As the days passed, Sophia thought about all the other people like her, the ones who had been taken advantage of, dismissed, and made to feel small. She thought about the elderly woman at the grocery store, fumbling to count out exact change while impatient customers sighed behind her. She thought about the man at the pharmacy, struggling to understand why his insurance had suddenly stopped covering his medication, while the clerk barely made an effort to explain. She thought about all the quiet humiliations people like her endured every day, and she decided that she wouldn't let it slide anymore. Not for herself, not for anyone. A future without fear. Sophia had spent so many years shrinking away from confrontation, afraid of making a fuss, afraid of being seen as a burden, but not anymore. She had learned that speaking up didn't make her difficult. It made her powerful. She had learned that asking for fairness didn't make her a problem. It made her someone who demanded respect. And she had learned that sometimes all it takes is one voice to change everything. From now on, she would never be afraid to use hers, because she wasn't just an elderly woman in a bank that day. She was a person who deserved to be heard. And now, the world was finally listening. The power of standing up for yourself, a lesson in strength and dignity. As we age, we gain something that no amount of money or power can buy: wisdom. We have lived through decades of change, experienced both hardship and joy, and learned lessons that only time can teach. Yet, too often, society forgets this. Too often, the elderly are treated as if they no longer have a voice, as if their presence is less valuable, their opinions less relevant, and their concerns less important. But here's the truth: we are not invisible. We are the foundation of families, of communities, of entire generations. We have worked, sacrificed, and contributed to the world in ways that cannot be measured. We still matter, and we always will. The importance of speaking up. Many of us were raised in a time when respect was expected and politeness was key. We were taught not to question authority, not to challenge unfairness, and to let things go. But in today's world, staying silent often allows others to take advantage. Have you ever been overcharged but felt uncomfortable asking for a correction? Have you been ignored in a waiting room while younger people were served first? Have you been dismissed when trying to voice a concern? These moments happen more often than we'd like to admit. And each time they do, we are faced with a choice: accept it quietly or stand up for ourselves. Speaking up is not about being rude. It's about demanding fairness, respect, and dignity. Strength is more than physical. The world often associates strength with youth, speed, and power. But true strength isn't just about physical ability. It's about resilience, confidence, and wisdom. Strength is knowing when to say no and when to demand what is rightfully yours. Strength is refusing to let others dismiss you just because of your age. Strength is standing your ground, not just for yourself, but for those who cannot. Because when we stand up for ourselves, we also stand up for future generations. We teach them that aging is not about fading into the background, but about carrying experience and dignity with pride. Your voice is your power. One of the most valuable things we have, no matter our age, is our voice. It's the tool we use to express our needs, share our stories, and demand respect. But if we do not use it, we risk losing it. Think of the changes that have happened in the world because people refused to be silent. Women won the right to vote, civil rights movements reshaped nations, and workers fought for fair wages, all because people spoke up. Even in everyday life, speaking up has power. When you demand fairness, you encourage businesses to treat customers better. When you correct an unfair charge, you stop a company from taking advantage of others. When you call out disrespect, you set a new standard for how elderly people should be treated. Each small action adds up to something bigger, leaving a legacy of strength. As we grow older, we often think about the legacy we leave behind. Will we be remembered as people who accepted unfair treatment, or as people who stood tall and commanded respect? Will we be known as silent observers, or as strong voices that made a difference? The choice is ours. Because aging is not about becoming weaker, it is about becoming bolder, wiser, and more confident in who we are. So the next time someone dismisses you, remind them that you have a voice. The next time you feel overlooked, demand to be seen. And the next time you wonder if it's worth speaking up, remember this: your words have power. Use them. If this message speaks to you, let's spread it together. Like this video if you believe in the power of standing up for yourself. Comment below, share a time when you had to demand respect. Subscribe to the channel for more stories and lessons that empower and inspire. Share this video with friends and family, because when we share wisdom, we grow stronger together. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. You are powerful, and the world needs to hear your voice.